Thank you very much, Melita Convendi, for this great introduction to our campaign, Translate, Transfer, Transform. And we will, of course, discuss this very often in the days to come. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, a very warm welcome to the opening press conference to the 74th Frankfurt Book Fair 2022. Over the last 2 years, we were in the rather dark Festhalle, and it's really great to be able to use Frankfurt Pavilion again today. This iconic Agora building in the center of the Frankfurt Book Fair is our cultural and political stage this year and gives us space for a discussion. I'd like to welcome the chairwoman of the German Publishers and Booksellers Association, Ms. Karin Schmidt-Friderichs, who will give you the current situation of the German book industry. Then Juergen, director of Frankfurt Book Fair, will give a presentation. He will talk about the importance of this year's book fair. And next, we'd like to welcome our literary guest, Mohsin Hamid, who came here from Lahore yesterday. Welcome to Frankfurt. And I will introduce Mohsin Hamid in a minute. Some organizational issues, some housekeeping issues before we start. After Mohsin Hamid's speech, you have the opportunity to ask questions. And then the press tour through the pavilion of the guest of honor will start. Everybody who'd like to join us, please come to the exit on the right-hand side. Regarding the languages, Karin Schmidt-Friderichs and Juergen will speak in German. Mohsin Hamid will give his presentation in English. And now I'd like to pass the floor to Karin Schmidt-Friderichs. Thank you, Ms. Grün. Mohsin Hamid, Juergen, dear journalists and bloggers, dear book enthusiasts. For almost 3 years, I've been the chairwoman of the German Publishers and Booksellers Association, and before end of October 2019, I took over this office. I accompanied my predecessor, Mr. Riedmüller, on one of the most successful book fairs of history with more than 300,000 visitors. And I took notes for my first book fair the year after this. And then everybody knows that everything changed. 2020, COVID forced us to go to the digital space. In 2022, we had wide aisles and carefully started a special edition. This afternoon, we will speak in front of 1,500 people with the federal president and his wife and the Spanish majesties, and we will open a book fair that we think will feel almost normal. And I have to be very clear and grateful for this. Our expectations when it comes to economic and aspects and content, it goes far beyond our expectations. I'm very glad about this, especially in my role as a chairwoman of the German Publishers and Booksellers Association. But I also have to thank Claudia Roth and her predecessor, Monika Grütters, for consistent support and unceasing belief in the industry and this fair. I'd like to thank the land of Hesse for the support and solidarity. I have to thank Messe Frankfurt for flexibility in times when planning is so necessary, but on the other hand, absolutely impossible. Director Juergen, I have to thank you and your team because they really did a great job. It was more than a marathon. I think it was an Ironman. Frankfurt Book Fair is more than the globally biggest marketplace for books and stories. It's an important cultural event to make sure nations understand each other in a world where there are so many differences in ideology and culture. The book industry and the peak of the industry in terms of events is the book fair, manages democratic exchange. Frankfurt Book Fair is the event where people from many different countries can meet with each other in security and peace and enter into a democratic dialogue. They talk with each other rather than about each other. They listen to each other, which in times of social media, where everybody tries to be the first in sending and nobody receives, cannot be taken for granted. Here, people meet with open-mindedness and respect in an atmosphere of tolerance and talking with each other and with the willingness to really come up with an opinion rather than insisting, I am right. And this is really an important thing about the book fair. 365 days of the year, book industry is a space for diversity and exchange, coming up with ideas when you read, thinking about ideas when you write, transferring ideas into different languages and cultures when it comes to translation. It's a room for meeting each other, understanding each other, and for responsibility, and, of course, last but not least, education. What will you see this year on the book fair? What is the drive of the book industry? Well, what you will see, Mr. Boos is going to tell you. Everything else, I'm going to tell you. 70 years after the end of World War II, we have a war violating international law against Ukraine. And in many ways, we have seen solidarity and willingness to support on part of many different people. We were able to collect 35,000 euro for Ukrainian bookshops and booksellers. We support their associations with contact and public support, and sometimes only with a mobile phone to make sure that people who are in exile can phone home. We give Ukrainian authors at the book fair a stage and a visibility to make sure that they can draw attention upon themselves, that they can take the floor. On Thursday, the day after tomorrow at 12:30, President Zelensky here at the Harmony Room at the book fair will give a speech. We also have representatives of the Russian opposition who at 2:30 here in the Pavilion will talk about their situation. So not only representatives of Ukraine, but also Russian dissidents will be able to speak here. Regarding the development in Ukraine, well, that's one thing, but we shouldn't forget other crises in the world. For example, the taking of power of Taliban and the protests in Afghanistan. I want to really express my solidarity with men and women in Iran who demonstrate for equal rights, and they do this by risking their own lives. And of course, we pay our respect to their actions and their courage. When it comes to the consequences of the Ukrainian war, we mustn't forget what is happening in many parts of the world when societies are drifting apart, when conflicts become fiercer and fiercer, when women are suppressed, when tolerance disappears, and when radical voices become louder and have more supporters. All this will be addressed at the book fair because this is what books do. Authors and publishing houses provide good background information and give you food for thought. They provide a depth of thinking in a society where we have clickbaiting and shitstorms, where people no longer take the time to think properly before they start acting. Bookshops and publishing houses provide people with valuable input, and they were able to do so when shops were closed during the lockdown because they are professionals and idealists. They get going, they go the extra mile because publishing houses and bookshops are not only economic enterprises but also institutions who are responsible for culture. This is what the Frankfurt Book Fair really does as well. And this is only possible if we have a good economic foundation. And this is the question in the months to come. High energy prices also mean extremely high prices for paper and for the printing industry. Publishing houses have to live with price increases of about 50% next year. They think there will be another 20 to 30% on top. This doesn't include increasing energy costs in the publishing house as such. If a publishing house has to pay more for producing a book, it may mean that the publishing house cannot afford to publish a book. And this would be very bad if a bookshop sees an increase of 300% in terms of energy costs without having a lot of financial reserves. This means the bookshop may go bust. The list of challenges of our industry is very, very long. But today, of course, I don't want to spoil the good mood here. The industry has shown a lot of resilience in the past. It was very committed when it came to the COVID pandemic. But in view of the unstable global and market situations, we now need balancing measures on part of politicians in order to be able to continue fulfilling our task. The uncertain situation of the book industry is also reflected in figures. September for the book market was the 5th month with declining sales in a row after 9 months of a decline of 2% below the normal years prior to 2019. In publishing houses, the situation is worse. Decline in sales after 3 quarters is 8.7%, and they weren't really well off before that. We have a lot of diversity of small and medium-sized companies, and the SMEs need support, financial support, if all their work of the last 2.5 years were not in vain. We do not have high margins and profits, and we cannot tighten the belt even more in order to compensate higher costs. So we demand from politicians who in the coalition agreement agreed on supporting publishing houses to really go ahead with it. Cultural events and also a good atmosphere in city centers is something everybody needs. The reduction of the VAT, which was agreed by the EU, should also be used to support the book industry. And publishing houses and bookshops who are affected by the crisis need to be supported. And here I'm talking about the SMEs. Only if the book industry as such is economically stable, it can contribute to the stability of society by supporting dialogue and making diversity reality, because this makes it unique and indispensable. Thank you. I'd like to hand over the floor to Juergen Boos.
You will know me. It's always when the book fair starts that I lose my voice. I'm not sure why this is. Karin, what are you doing to me? Anyway, Ms. Schmidt-Friderichs, dear Mohsin Hamid, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the 74th book fair, after the re-foundation in 1949, is presenting itself to the world public after 2 years of pandemic, as it's always been the most important meeting point of the international publishers industry. And unfortunately, it's now 40 years that I look back to. My first book fair was 40 years ago, so it's almost can't be true, really. But it's like a family meeting for me, and for many in our industry, it is a family meeting. And I would like to also mention the readers who are going to come here on the weekend. We are a big family of readers, but it's really important to me today to really bring home three messages which I'd like to address. The first message is the Frankfurt Book Fair, after 2 years of pandemic, is fully back in full, and it still is the most important point of discourse for the industry. It's a personal encounter, which is the key means for social or societal exchange. And three, the big VIPs from politics and literary life are here in person. It is not virtual, it is not online, and this really also underlines the importance of the big book fair, biggest book fair in the world. Let me mention a few figures. We expect more than 4,000 exhibitors from more than 94 countries. They are all here, big publishers from the UK, from the US, the small companies, the owner-managed publishers from German-speaking areas and all over the world, the science publishers, the children's books publishers, the audio and the film people. International exchange, which will be at the center for the next few days. For example, in the Literary Agent Center or the Technical Trade Program, where opinion leaders will feel the pulse of the industry. And our international exchange programs also promote that. The special program for publishers from Ukraine and neighboring countries, the Frankfurt Fellowship Program, the invitation program, the promotion programs for German language translators, young translators, and something which is very important for me is the spotlight on Africa. 2022, more than 110 publishers and booksellers, literary agents, translators, rights managers from more than 15 countries participated in our program, which are also being translated by means from the Foreign Office in Germany. So, ladies and gentlemen, this intense personal exchange it creates a network of exchange and information and a conversation, and translators have been contributing for a lot of this, but they are sometimes below the limelight. The Xavier Marias, for example, who died too early, I would have wished to meet him before the run-up to this meeting in Madrid, but he wrote the novel My Heart So White, and this was really a monument to translators. And of course, some of these translators, interpreters can't really support the empty phrases, and they make fun of turning this conversation, which they translate, that's all in the novel, into a humoristic take on politicians and VIPs. And of course, we also have a program, Translate, Transform and Transfer, and it's about a highbrow literary translation which should be as close to the original as possible. It's also about translation as an act of communication, because without communication there is no understanding. At the fair is the central place for this topic, and we have a new International Center for Translation in 4.0, Hall 4.0, which we hold together with the German Language Association of Translators. And for a technical audience, the Literary Agents Center will be the linchpin of everything. It has really developed a lot in recent years, and it's about the negotiation of rights and trading of rights. This also now includes film, audio, book rights, streaming, and also games. This year, this center has been booked out very early. It will also strike you when you walk through the halls that many exhibitors have their own stages now, presenting themselves with their own stages, and they are really engaging in direct exchange with the audience, with readers. As to how you can open up new groups of readers, well, this will be the topic of Sunday's Tech Top stage, where people from the community will exchange with authors and publishers. This is another innovation at the fair, which looks at new trends and developments in the book trade every year. This leads me to my second message. As an international and open space for discourse, we are more important than ever. Ms. Schmidt-Friderichs already mentioned it. We are completely flabbergasted by a war in Europe which threatens the whole peace order after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Is it allowed to talk about Ukrainian literature if there is a war going on in Ukraine when it's about freedom or non-freedom, about life or death? This is a quote, actually, and Manfred Zappa, Volker Weichsel are asking themselves in the tutorial of the new magazine Eastern Europe, with it entitled Resistance, Ukrainian Literature at Time times of war? We all know the answer. I would like to also quote the two editors. We must not only, but we have to look at Ukrainian literature and culture at times of war, because culture is a source of education about a country which for decades has been ignored in Germany, has been repressed, has been treated as a misunderstood part of Russia, and has been misinterpreted also. This is a tome which is 500 pages thick, and I'd like to recommend this to you. My team and myself are really pleased to have made a contribution to the genesis of this book. We have tried it. We have taken over some of the translation costs of some texts. The Ukrainian Publishers Association has a big stand in Hall 4.0, and there is a focus theme for 2 days in the Frankfurt Pavilion on this. It's an act of resistance against the attempt to annihilate the culture of this country. In cooperation with the Ukrainian Book Institute, the Goethe Institute of Ukraine, and the Federal Association for Political Education, we would like to create a public awareness for the fact for what is at stake. We are excitedly expecting the speech by the Ukrainian President, Vladimir Zelensky, who is going to address a video message to us on Friday on the invitation of the Book Fair and also the International Association of Publishers. On the Saturday, the Ukrainian First Lady will be talking to a talk format streamed Bring It Alive. But the whole world has turned crazy. The whole world has turned upside down. The sky above Tehran also has darkened. We are seeing a regime which is putting all the stops, fighting against its own citizens, mainly women. And the way it tries to suppress the culture of peaceful protest and the yearning for freedom. It is at this point in the Frankfurt Pavilion that in the next few days we're going to talk about topics which give us food for thought. Events about Iran, about Afghanistan, about societal diversity, anti-Semitism, or violence against the culture creatives all across the world. The social developments and tensions must be reflected here. This is one of the tasks of the book fair, and we are a mirror of what is going on in the book trade. This is best done by the biggest presence of bookish people, of readers, of authors, politicians with liberal democratic views. That's the only way we can avoid polarization in society and empoisoned culture of debates. By strengthening democratic discourse, creating a stage for diversity, and addressing controversial topics with mutual respect. The book fair is the counter model of an echo chamber. It's the antidote to an echo chamber. Diversity in languages, for example, will be the focus of our guest of honor, Spain, which has the motto of vibrant creativity. And a quarter of the authors are writing in one of the languages, Basque, Galician, or Catalan, so not in Spanish. So we are looking forward to Antonio Munoz Molina, for example, is going to speak tonight. Manuel Rivas, who is going to do the passing over of the guest role to the next country, Cristina Morales, Rosa Montero, and many others. I can't name them all. The big appreciation of the book fair, that's my third aspect, is that we're coming back with prominent VIPs. We're expecting the Spanish Royal Couple, Felipe VI and Queen Letizia, the Federal President, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the Hesse Minister President, Boris Rhein, the Frankfurt Mayor, Eskandari Grünberg, for the ceremonial opening tonight. And from the Federal Cabinet, we're going to welcome Nancy Faeser, Lisa Paus, Christine Lambrecht, Claudia Roth, whose ministries have helped us in the last 2 years, in these difficult years. And the list of prominent authors from all over the world continues. The Nobel laureate, Arturo Sambron, Leila Slimani, Donna Leon, Ian Kershaw, and so on and so forth. They're all here. And the pandemic has put lots of things upside down. It has changed our routines and our lives. The book fair is also concerned by it, but I'm very confident, looking to the future of the fair. We need this place where for 5 days the whole world is talking about books. Mohsin Hamid today is a guest whose novel, The Last White Man, is a big talking point in Germany. He's creating a scenario where the white population of an unnamed city changes in the color of its skin. What happens when norms and things which are taken for granted change and are challenged? When a community all of a sudden is confronted with its fears, when the prejudice becomes visible. So I'm looking forward to one of the most important voices of current literature. Thank you very much, Mohsin, for having come today. I would like to ask you for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me and having me at the book fair this year. It's a pleasure to be here in person. When I was a child in California in the 1970s, I believed that the world would keep getting better. This seemed obvious to me. We lived in the preamble to science fiction. In the week that I was born, the fourth pair of human beings ever to walk on the moon arrived there and went on their mission. As a 6-year-old, I followed broadcasts of the first space shuttle undergoing test flights just a few hours away from our house. I saved beautiful postage stamps depicting the Viking probes to Mars. In the 1980s, I lived in Pakistan. We had a horrible dictator and experienced the fallout of the Soviet-American proxy war in Afghanistan. But relatively safe in my comfortable neighborhood, I still believed the world would continue to improve. Sure enough, when I was 17, our dictator died, and a young woman named Benazir Bhutto was elected our prime minister. A year later, the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, and the Berlin Wall fell. I spent the 1990s in the United States. The American economy was booming, at least for students at elite universities like me. Email arrived, and the internet, and web browsers, and .coms. Friends of mine were leaving their studies, leaving their jobs, to found new companies and become multimillionaires. Some even succeeded. There were wars, of course, and genocides, and an emerging sense that fossil fuels might be a problem, but surely nothing, I reasoned, that technology and democracy in the market could not solve. The 2000s were more problematic for me, but somehow my sense of optimism remained mostly intact. I spent the decade in London, and from there I saw, on television, the Twin Towers fall, and the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq begin, and tens of thousands die in terrorist and counter-terrorist violence in Pakistan. I was stopped and searched at Western airports, held and questioned for hours at immigration. The financial crisis struck and threatened to bring national economies to their knees. But still, I had faith this disastrous era would pass. I believed a trend towards the better would return. I forced myself to continue to believe through much of the 2010s, living once again in Pakistan. I forced myself to believe through the Syrian civil war. I forced myself to believe through Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. I forced myself to believe through Pakistan's rolling back of civil liberties and press freedoms and democracy, through the terrible Pakistani floods of 2010, through the shockingly rapid retreat of glaciers in the Himalayas, through the blistering day in 2017 when my nation recorded a temperature of 53.7 degrees Celsius. And then, sometime around 2020, as the COVID pandemic came, and it was every country for itself, and borders closed, and there were no flights in or out of Pakistan for many weeks, and schools and offices were shut, and driving around was restricted, and the stars came out again at night because the pollution had receded, and bees and butterflies and birds were everywhere, and my city of 12 million people was quiet. I could no longer force myself to believe, and I found that my faith in inevitable improvement was gone. I no longer believed our world would just get better. I spoke to my friends on my phone and on my computer, both around the city and around the world, and it struck me that they no longer believed either. I turned 50 in 2021, and my birthday arrived with no real sense of celebration, but rather with a feeling, which I tried to hide, both from others and from myself, of confusion and of loss. I often lecture at schools and universities in many different countries, and I often hear from young people that they never believed what I believed. They never believed the world was getting better. For them, it seemed instead that it was getting worse. Their parents might have grown up in a less troubled era, but for their own generation, the task was just to do the best they could in the face of mounting uncertainty and anxiety. At first, I tried to explain to them that I had been able to believe for so long because I had thought there was a clear formula for progress, the formula of democracy plus science plus economics. Even as I said this, however, I realized that the foundation of my old conviction was both more simple and more profound than that. I had believed that the world would get better because I had believed in the irresistibility of cooperation. But in recent times, cooperation has gone into reverse. We know that without cooperation, we cannot tackle challenges like climate change, inequality, migration, disease, weapons of mass destruction. And yet we seemed determined to cooperate less and less. Our world is fracturing into mutually suspicious nations and clans and tribes. I do not know why this is the case, though, like all of us, I do have my theories. One of these theories is that we have been taking what was not ours to take. We have taken huge sums of money from future generations in the form of debt. We have taken millions of years of sunshine from the past in the form of fossil fuels. We have depleted our aquifers and poisoned our rivers and our air. We have exploited our poor and our vulnerable. We have been stealing, and now we have been caught. Our punishment is the destruction of our environmental and social habitats. We feel this destruction as a diminishment of our potential. We feel the pie is shrinking, and so we must each grab as big a slice as possible. Eventually, new solutions will be found. Better and fairer ways of using energy and building economies and organizing societies. And once that happens, our turn away from cooperation will be reversed. But between now and then, we face terrible risks unknown to our ancestors. As we polarize and tribalize, we are unlike the civilizations of the past in one very important dimension. We are vastly more powerful. The harm we can do to one another and to our planet is unprecedented in its scope and complexity. We require, therefore, a resistance to the current trend away from cooperation. Some of us must swim against the tide. Which brings me, at last, to novels, to literature. The fate of humanity is shaped by the stories we choose to believe in. And in the domain of fiction, we have three main mass storytelling forms: film, television, and books. Film and television show us a world that looks like our world. People look like people. Trees look like trees. The audiences of these stories are viewers. But books are different. Books look nothing like our world. When we open a book, we encounter letters and punctuation marks against a white field. It is we who then create in our imagination people and places and sights and sounds. The reader of a book is not a viewer. Readers are creators, inspired by the source code of the text they hold in their hands. Writers do not write novels. Writers write half novels. It is readers who take these half novels and animate them into what they experience as novels. Readers are the casting directors and cinematographers of the films of novels that play out in their minds. To read a book is to engage in a radical act of co-creation. And to write a book is to invite another human being into a shared space of imaginative play. It is, in essence, similar to what we did as children when we met with a friend and pretended to be at a tea party or in outer space, when we pretended to be pirates and we said, "This tree is the mast of a ship, and this grass is the ocean, and these fallen leaves are the fins of sharks." But when we grow up, we tend to leave these games behind. As adults, most of us do not engage in such shared imaginative play. The very idea seems somehow to embarrass us. Except when we are alone, that is, and we pick up a book, and we give ourselves permission to play in our imagination with another person, a person we do not know and who is not there, a writer. As our world turns away from cooperation, this is why novels are important. Not only because they tell us stories of people who are different from us and allow us to empathize and encourage us to blur the boundaries between one group and another. No, novels are also important because of their form, because writing and reading a book is itself a profound and hopeful act of cooperation. Novels emanate from our desire for the fertility that arises when we remember that it is we who imagine ourselves and our world into existence, that we are jointly the authors of what we call reality, and that we can choose to author differently. In a world that seems to be entering into a time of darkness, novels are embers that we cup in our hands, embers of potential. They remind us that we can remake our world together. But far more important, in our time of turning away, they remind us that we want to. Thank you.